Judge Amul Thapar entered the hearing with a reputation that preceded him, known for his sharp intellect, his meticulous questioning style, and his ability to put witnesses or political figures on the defensive. He often carried himself as though every exchange was his courtroom. On this day, his target was Representative Jasmine Crockett, a figure whose growing prominence and direct style had begun to unsettle many who preferred debates to remain predictable and controlled. Thapar's approach was clear: craft a question so carefully framed that it left no easy way out, forcing Crockett to either concede ground or appear evasive. This tactic was not new for him. It was a method he had used successfully countless times in his career. As he leaned forward, his voice measured and precise, he laid out his line of questioning. Each word was deliberate, carrying the weight of authority. He presented his premise as though it were airtight, building it piece by piece so that the trap seemed invisible at first glance. The room was silent, eyes fixed on him as he delivered his question. Those who had watched him work before could sense what he was doing. He was tightening the walls, ensuring that whatever answer came next would play into his strategy. To the casual listener, it sounded like a simple challenge, but to those who knew the game, it was a setup. His confidence in the moment was palpable. There was a rhythm to his questioning, a cadence that suggested he had already imagined the outcome. The expectation was that Jasmine Crockett would either struggle to defend herself against the built-in assumptions of his inquiry, or find herself cornered into conceding, something she did not want to admit. But Crockett was not one to fall quietly into someone else's frame. As he finished, she paused briefly, the kind of pause that communicates both thought and certainty. Instead of reacting defensively or trying to maneuver around his wording, she looked directly at him and addressed the very structure of his question. In one swift move, she exposed the flaw hidden within his carefully designed trap. By pointing out that his premise rested on shaky ground, she dismantled the question before it had a chance to box her in. Judge Thapar had built a wall, but Crockett showed that the foundation beneath it was weak, and once she said it aloud, it became clear to everyone in the room. Her voice was steady, not confrontational, but precise enough to cut through the tension. She explained how the assumptions embedded in his phrasing were not only misleading, but also irrelevant to the actual issue at hand. The moment she did this, the illusion of control began to slip from Judge Thapar's hands. His attempt to control the exchange by narrowing the terms of the conversation had backfired. Instead of being cornered, Crockett had created space for herself, expanding the discussion beyond the limits he had tried to impose. Observers in the room could sense the shift. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. What had started as a display of judicial confidence turned into a reminder that Crockett was not easily shaken. She had listened closely, picked apart his tactic, and responded with clarity. For Judge Thapar, it was an unusual moment. His method, which so often worked to his advantage, had been stripped down in seconds, leaving him with little ground to stand on. The scene highlighted a fundamental clash between styles: Thapar's reliance on structured traps and Crockett's refusal to play by those limits. His strategy had always been to force his counterpart into a narrow space where every response benefited him, but Crockett shifted the balance, not by playing defense, but by refusing to accept the framing at all. In doing so, she left him in a position where pressing further risked making the flaw in his original question even more obvious. The silence that followed her response carried its own weight. People in the room knew they had just witnessed something unusual, not a shouting match, not a dramatic showdown, but a clean dismantling of a tactic that usually worked. Judge Thapar, despite his experience, found himself momentarily stalled. His plan interrupted. Crockett, without raising her voice or changing her calm demeanor, had shown that she was not only prepared for the challenge but also capable of flipping the situation entirely. It was in that moment that the dynamics of the hearing shifted. What had begun with Judge Thapar confidently setting the stage ended with Jasmine Crockett taking control, her clarity leaving little room for rebuttal. The attempt to corner her had collapsed under the weight of its own weak structure, exposed by someone who refused to be contained by it. When Judge Amul Thapar realized that his first attempt to corner Jasmine Crockett had not gone as planned, he tried to recalibrate. His instinct was to press further, to reformulate his questioning in a way that would restore the balance of control he had momentarily lost. He leaned back slightly, his eyes fixed on her, the practiced calm of someone who had faced countless challenges in courtrooms and hearings before. Yet beneath that composure was a flicker of urgency. He was not accustomed to being stopped so quickly, and the fact that Crockett had dismantled his framing with ease left him in an unfamiliar position. His second question came sharper, as if precision could substitute for the ground he had already lost. He tightened the wording, stripped it of excess, and presented it with the authority that often left others reluctant to challenge him. But Jasmine Crockett had already seen through his method. She recognized that Judge Thapar was relying on the same foundation as before, dressing it differently but still building on assumptions that simply did not hold. The moment his words landed, she shifted forward, unflinching. Instead of taking his new framing at face value, she peeled it apart, exposing that it was only a rephrased version of the same flawed strategy. Her response was not loud or theatrical, but it carried the kind of weight that made it impossible to dismiss. she didn't just argue against his wording. She revealed why his entire line of questioning was fundamentally misplaced. What made the exchange striking was how quickly she disarmed his effort. Judge Thapar had invested time and care into refining the structure of his questions, ensuring they carried the subtle pressure that typically boxed his counterparts into corners. Crockett, however, approached them with a different lens. She treated his phrasing not as something she had to defend herself against, but as something that needed to be examined. By shifting attention to the assumptions within his question, she removed his ability to dictate the terms of the discussion. In doing so, she showed that his authority in the exchange was only as strong as the validity of the frame he imposed, and once that frame was exposed as faulty, it crumbled. The audience watching could sense the difference between his intent and her reception. For Judge Thapar, the exchange was supposed to follow a familiar script: his question, her limited response, his carefully placed follow-up, and the eventual narrowing of her options until she conceded something. Yet Crockett had rewritten that script in real time. Each time he tried to tighten the focus, she widened it, showing that the boundaries he was attempting to enforce were artificial. Rather than reacting within the trap, she lifted the conversation outside of it, leaving him without the leverage he usually wielded. Her composure was key. Judge Thapar's questioning carried a tone of authority that often caused people to second-guess themselves or stumble in their defense. Crockett, however, responded with a steadiness that made it clear she was not intimidated by either his role or his tactics. When he spoke, she listened carefully, not rushing to respond, but also not allowing the pause to suggest hesitation. When she answered, her words were concise, each one aimed at the heart of his assumption. The sharpness of her delivery made it difficult for him to push back without exposing the weakness of his premise further. Judge Thapar attempted to interrupt at one point, hoping to redirect or clarify his intention, but Crockett did not yield. She held her ground, finishing her point with the same level of precision she had started with. The interruption only highlighted the shift in dynamics. He was the one now on the defensive, trying to salvage the direction of the exchange, while she remained in control. The subtle shift in body language told its own story, where Thapar had begun with confidence and command. Now he carried the weight of trying to recover, while Crockett sat firmly with the air of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to assert. For those in the room, the shock came not from raised voices or dramatic gestures, but from the simplicity of it. Judge Amul Thapar, a figure so often associated with intellectual dominance in exchanges, was being met with resistance that did not bend. Crockett's strategy was not to fight within the frame, but to remove the frame entirely, leaving him without the tools he normally used to control the dialogue. Each time he tried to corner her, she revealed the flaw in the attempt, making his precision feel less like strength and more like limitation. By the end of that the contrast between them was unmistakable. Judge Thapar, despite his experience and his standing, had found himself repeatedly neutralized by Crockett's clarity. She had not only recognized his tactic but turned it into a weakness, showing that control of the conversation does not rest in who asks the questions, but in who refuses to accept faulty premises. It was a reversal that played out quietly, but unmistakably, leaving Judge Thapar's effort to corner her exposed for what it was: an attempt that simply could not withstand her precision. As the exchange continued, Judge Amul Thapar tried once again to re-establish his footing. He had built his reputation on commanding conversations, on asking questions so tightly woven that they allowed little room for maneuvering. In many of his past encounters, this technique had worked to perfection, putting his counterpart in the difficult position of either accepting the framing or appearing evasive when dodging it. On this occasion, however, Jasmine Crockett made it evident that she was operating on an entirely different level. Instead of being caught between two unsatisfying choices, she refused the premise altogether, and in doing so, she redirected the flow of the dialogue back toward her own terms. This refusal to play within his boundaries marked the true turning point in their interaction. Judge Thapar leaned forward again, his tone calm but carrying the weight of authority. He attempted to reshape his argument into a sharper point, hoping that Crockett's previous dismantling had been a one-time display of quick thinking. This time, he crafted his words carefully, pressing her on specifics in a way that was designed to leave no room for dismissal. To those watching, it looked like he was tightening the net, trying to make it harder for her to slip away. Yet Crockett was not slipping away at all. She was stepping directly into the space he created and unraveling the logic before it had a chance to close in. Her response was deliberate. She didn't rush to counter him, nor did she allow the framing to dictate her tone. Instead, she picked apart his phrasing piece by piece, exposing the assumptions hiding underneath the polished surface. She highlighted how the question was not only built on faulty ground, but also misdirected from the actual issues that mattered. By doing so, she left him in the unusual position of having his intellectual precision turned back on him. What was meant to be his advantage became his vulnerability. His reliance on clever framing, usually so effective, was suddenly stripped of power when Crockett refused to validate it. The atmosphere in the room shifted noticeably at this point. Those observing began to recognize that this was no ordinary exchange between a judge and a representative. Judge Thapar's authority, while still commanding, no longer felt decisive. Crockett's control of the moment was undeniable, and it wasn't achieved through force or volume, but through her ability to expose the weakness in his strategy. He had expected her to defend herself within the confines of his questions, but instead she reframed the conversation in real time, turning what was meant to trap her into an opportunity to showcase her clarity and command. Asterisk for Judge Thapar. It was an unfamiliar dynamic. His experience as a federal judge meant that his words often carried unquestioned weight, shaping the tone and direction of exchanges. In a courtroom, his framing would likely have gone unchallenged, but Crockett treated him not as an authority who dictated the terms, but as another participant whose arguments could and should be scrutinized. That shift unsettled the usual balance of power. The very thing that gave him control in so many past interactions, his role and his reputation, was neutralized by her refusal to grant those advantages unquestioned authority. Asterisks. She never lost her composure. Her body language was steady, her tone consistent, her delivery unshaken. Every time Judge Thapar tried to box her in, she created more space. Each answer carried a clarity that made it difficult for him to interrupt without appearing as though he was deflecting. When he tried to interject, she held firm, finishing her thoughts with a determination that made it clear she was not going to be rushed or silenced. It was not confrontation for the sake of spectacle. It was precision against precision, and hers was proving sharper in that moment. Asterisk observers could sense the growing imbalance. What began as a confident attempt by Judge Thapar to assert control had transformed into a sequence of exchanges where his authority seemed to wane with every response. Crockett's ability to dismantle his phrasing highlighted how fragile his strategy could be when faced with someone unwilling to accept its terms. It was a lesson in how power in dialogue does not always come from the one asking the questions, but from the one who decides whether the questions deserve an answer as posed. Asterisk. By the time that portion of the exchange concluded, the outcome was clear. Judge Thapar had tried to tighten his grip on the discussion, but Crockett had loosened it with every word. His effort to corner her had not only failed, it had showcased her ability to turn the tables without ever raising her voice. What was supposed to be his moment of control became hers, and the sharpness with which she dismantled his framing left little doubt about who held command of the conversation. The final stage of the exchange between Judge Amul Thapar and Jasmine Crockett unfolded in a way that surprised nearly everyone in the room. What had begun as his confident attempt to corner her had, over time, shifted into a contest of composure and clarity. By the time the last question was posed, it was clear that Crockett had no intention of yielding, and Judge Thapar had no intention of stepping back. He pressed once more, this time with a sense of determination that suggested he was trying to reclaim the authority he had lost. His words were pointed, his tone deliberate, and his delivery carried the weight of someone who is used to having the final word. Asterisk. Judge Thapar tried to build a narrative through his questioning, stitching together fragments of earlier exchanges into a final push. The strategy was to remind Crockett of what he had asked before, to suggest that she had evaded something critical, and to frame his inquiry as the inevitable conclusion of all that had come before. It was a move designed to reassert control, to remind everyone watching that his voice still carried authority. The audience, sensing the build-up, leaned in, waiting to see how Crockett would respond. Many anticipated that this might be the moment where she finally had to concede ground, if only to acknowledge his persistence. Asterisk, but Crockett did not falter. Instead, she turned his closing push into an opportunity to solidify her position even further. With the same precision she had shown throughout, she listened closely, dissecting his phrasing as he laid it out. When her turn came, she responded not with defensiveness but with clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. She pointed out, calmly and directly, that his attempt to tie his arguments together still relied on the same flawed assumptions she had already dismantled earlier. By highlighting this, she undercut the foundation of his final push before it could gain momentum. Asterisk, the effect was immediate. Judge Thapar, despite his practiced demeanor, was left without the ability to pivot quickly enough to counter her point. His strategy depended on his questions being treated as the framework of the conversation, but Crockett once again refused to accept that framework. Her refusal was not combative, it was logical and steady, which made it even more effective. Instead of appearing as though she was resisting his authority for the sake of resistance, she showed that his argument simply could not withstand scrutiny. Asterisk, spectators noticed the shift in energy. Judge Thapar's attempt to build pressure had turned into a moment where the weight fell back on him. Crockett's words carried the confidence of someone who had prepared not just for questions, but for the tactics behind them. Her ability to stay calm, measured, and precise in her delivery made his final effort appear less like a decisive challenge and more like a repetition of what she had already dismantled. His insistence, rather than cornering her, revealed how little ground he had gained. Asterisk, in those moments, the contrast between them was striking. Judge Thapar projected authority through the role he carried and the precision of his language, but Crockett projected authority through mastery of the exchange itself. he sought to dictate the terms. She refused to let the terms go unchallenged. He tried to narrow her choices. She expanded the scope to show that the limitations were artificial. The result was not a dramatic clash, but a quiet demonstration of how composure can neutralize even the most carefully constructed attempts at control. Asterisk for Judge Thapar. The experience was unusual. He was rarely confronted with someone who not only resisted his framing but did so with such clarity that it left him without a clear path forward. His usual strength-sharp questioning had met a counterpart who turned that sharpness back on him. Crockett did not need to raise her voice, interrupt, or overwhelm him. She simply needed to reveal, piece by piece, that his efforts were built on weak ground. And once she did, the authority he carried into the room could no longer dominate the conversation. Asterisk by the close of the exchange, it was Jasmine Crockett's voice that lingered. Judge Thapar's attempts to corner her had not succeeded. Instead, they had highlighted her ability to resist, to dissect, and to hold her ground. He tried to press, to corner, to tighten the space around her, but she refused each attempt with precision and poise. What was supposed to end with his authority reaffirmed ended instead with her position solidified. The final question, meant to close the loop, had only opened the space for her to demonstrate that she could not be confined. By the time the exchange between Judge Thapar and Jasmine Crockett concluded, the atmosphere in the room carried a weight that could not be ignored. What had begun as an attempt by the judge to corner her through sharp, carefully crafted questioning had turned into a lesson in composure and clarity. His strategy, rooted in precision and the authority of his role, had met a response that refused to be boxed in. Crockett did not rise to the bait, nor did she allow herself to be forced into narrow choices. Instead, she dismantled his framing with calm precision, showing that the power of a question lies not in how it is asked, but in whether its foundation can withstand scrutiny. Asterisk the impact of this interaction was more than the sum of their words. It demonstrated how authority in dialogue is not absolute. Judge Thapar entered with the expectation that his role and his reputation would set the tone. For a moment, it seemed like the familiar rhythm would carry him. He would pose, she would defend, and the narrowing space would leave her conceding, something he wanted. But Crockett disrupted that rhythm entirely. She shifted the balance by treating his words not as unchallengeable, but as constructions to be examined. That shift transformed the exchange. What was meant to expose her instead exposed the limitations of his method. Asterisk. Observers walked away with a clear impression that the interaction had not been equal in its outcome. Judge Thapar had tried multiple times to reset, to recover his footing. But each effort ended the same way, with Crockett revealing that the ground beneath his questioning was weak. This was not accomplished through spectacle or dramatics, but through deliberate calm. Her ability to maintain composure, to respond with precision rather than defensiveness, made her position stronger with every exchange. It was this steadiness that ultimately turned the tables, leaving the judge with little room to maneuver. Asterisk for Crockett. The significance was more than a single victory in dialogue. It showed her ability to withstand pressure from one of the sharpest legal minds in the room, and not just to withstand it, but to use it as a platform to demonstrate her own clarity and resolve. For Judge Thapar, it served as a reminder that even the most carefully constructed lines of questioning are vulnerable. When their assumptions are not sound, his reputation for sharpness remained. But in this moment, it had met an equal who refused to give it unquestioned weight. Asterisk in the end. The moment stood out because it was not loud or chaotic, but precise and quiet. The attempt to corner had failed, not with confrontation, but with clarity. And in that failure lay the most striking part of the exchange. The realization that control in dialogue belongs not to the one who asks the hardest question, but to the one who refuses to accept the question on flawed terms. It was there, in that refusal, that Jasmine Crockett shut him down instantly, leaving an impression that would not soon be forgotten.